At the beginning of the film, it was explained that the United States experienced very terrible inflation. Gas prices, basic needs, and bank interest rates soared. People believed that this happened because the government had appointed officials who were incompetent in their fields, especially in the financial sector. As a result, the economy was in chaos while the officials were getting richer. On Wall Street, there was one of the large companies that operated in investment. The head of this company is a man named Jeremy. He decided to do something cunning by asking his two managers to ask all employees to look for more clients. After all the clients' money was collected, they would make it look like the stock market was going down. Initially, one of the managers protested because their job would make misery for the clients, but Jeremy didn't care anymore because the most important thing was that they could get as much money as possible. After that, Jeremy's two managers immediately asked all their employees to contact old or new clients so they would invest in their company. The scene switches to a husband and wife named Jim and Rosie Baxford. Apparently, once a week, Jim would accompany Rosie to check on the tumor on her head. The doctor said that the tumor on her head had indeed disappeared, but to prevent the tumor from coming back, he still had to have a checkup every week. She had to be injected with hormones. At home, Rosie was frustrated as she felt that her life was just a burden for Jim because their family was in a lot of debt after she got sick 5 years ago. Jim tried to calm her and was sure that everything would be fine. He would always be enthusiastic about working so that their economic problems would soon improve. The next day, Jim went to work as a security guard guarding an armored truck containing money that would be sent to the central bank. Jim expressed his complaints to a friend named Scene, who then tried to encourage him by saying that everything would definitely be okay. During their break, they gathered with two policemen who were also their friends named Frank and Freddie at a canteen. Here, Frank and Freddie also complained about their economic problems. The government suddenly cut their salaries and pension funds. Frank said that he had caught dozens of robbers, but the real robbers were the officials who were crazy about money and position. According to Frank, these officials were the ones who should be arrested and replaced with honest and trustworthy officials. While smiling, Freddie joked by saying that there were no more trusty politicians anymore. A week later, Rosie returned to the doctor for routine examinations and hormone injections. Jim always paid for the examination fees with a credit card, which he had to pay in installments every month because the company where he worked didn't want to cover insurance for his wife. It was revealed that Jim's savings from his pension from the army had been invested in a stock sold by the company led by Jeremy on Wall Street. Jim looked panicked after knowing the shares price he bought had plummeted. The next day, Jim met one of Jeremy's company employees named Robert. It turned out that Robert was the one who had been promising profits for his investment. Jim, who couldn't believe the company anymore, asked Robert to withdraw the money immediately and return it before the shares were forfeited. But Robert calmly answered that the investment money could not be withdrawn until the agreed time. He also assured Jim that his company's shares would definitely rise again in a few weeks. Hearing all this, Jim kept asking Robert to withdraw his money, but Robert instead rushed to leave. In the evening, Jim saw his shares falling further. He began to realize that he was being played with, so he immediately contacted Robert. When connected, Jim said that he would sue the company in court because it was clear that the company was a fraud. The next day, Jim went to a lawyer to smooth out his lawsuit in court. After he explained all the problems, the lawyer was ready to help him in any way. He also promised that he could solve a problem like this very easily. But before doing the work, her asked Jim to pay for the services in advance. But when he found out that Jim didn't have any money, he told Jim to leave and come back if he had the money. The next day, during break time, Jim was asked by his three friends why he looked gloomy. Jim said that he needed money to pay a lawyer and sue a fraudulent investment company that took his pension savings. However, because his three friends were also experiencing economic difficulties, they couldn't do much. After Frank and Freddie left, Scene suddenly said that he had savings and he would lend them to Jim. Jim initially refused because he didn't want to trouble Scene. However, because Scene kept insisting, in the end, he was willing to accept the money. Shortly after, Jim immediately met the lawyer and gave him the money, hoping that the lawyer could immediately help him return his investment money from Robert's hands. On the other hand, Rosie, his wife, continued to have routine checkups and hormone injections. When Jim was at home, Rosie realized that her husband was carrying a very heavy burden and their finances were getting worse. Even Jim had to borrow money just to fulfill daily needs. One day, Rosie refused to go to the doctor because he knew that Jim couldn't afford it anymore. She also knew that the bank bills were piling up day by day. Even one of the banks that Jim once owed money to would now seize the house soon. After knowing that, Jim immediately called the lawyer he had paid because it turned out that the lawyer hadn't been able to be contacted for quite a while, but when the call connected, the lawyer casually said that Jim's claim was invalid because the company he was suing was protected by law. Rosie, who also heard the news, immediately blamed herself, thinking that her life was just a burden for Jim, but Jim calmed her by saying that everything would be fine. He then excused himself from work because he couldn't bear to see his wife who kept crying. The bad news didn't stop there. At the office, Jim was called by his boss who suddenly fired him, considering his economic difficulty would disrupt his work with a lot of money. After Jim was fired, he was determined to go to the Ministry of Manpower office to report his unilateral fire. But when Jim had been waiting for a long time, the minister's assistant turned him away because the minister was out of town. At the same time, Jim was angered because it turned out that the minister was in his office. The assistant finally said that the minister didn't have the time to deal with the poor. On the other hand, Rosie continued to blame herself and finally decided to end her life so that he could make Jim's life easier. In short, when Jim came home, he found Rosie's wedding ring and a letter from Rossi. He immediately went upstairs to check on her, only to find her sleeping over blood in her bed. Losing her was the hardest blow for Jim. Jim could no longer hold back his tears during Rosie's funeral, and this was the comeback point for Jim to seek justice. Initially, he felt that his life had been completely destroyed. He spent his days just drinking alcohol and never picked up calls from 3 of his friends who wanted to know news from him, until one night, when he was walking aimlessly, he accidentally saw the minister partying with rich people. Not long after, the minister came out to answer the phone. At that time, Jim approached the man and asked why he didn't want to side with the poor. The man arrogantly said that the poor couldn't make money for him. Irritated, Jim pushed the man, causing him to be hit by a taxi and die. Jim chose to immediately run away through the alley. The news of the minister's death became the talk of the country, but fortunately, the police thought that it was all just an ordinary accident. Meanwhile, Jim promised to massacre the officials who had made a mess in the financial system of the country. His plan started by visiting a newspaper printing house to find information about those who were involved in the corruption. The next day, people from the bank came to his house, telling him that he had to leave immediately because his house would be confiscated within 24 hours. Without wasting more time, Jim packed up all his important belongings, including the sniper rifle that he had been keeping. After that, he decided to live in a cheap rented house with the severance pay he still had. Jim got a call from Sean and his 2 police friends who were worried about his condition after the death of his wife, because he never wanted to answer their call, inviting him to gather where they used to hang out. However, because Jim was planning something big, he said that he still needed alone time a little more. Jim went to meet an illegal weapons dealer with the remaining money he had and bought a weapon to carry out all his plans and 2 grenades. After that, he went to a quiet place to practice his shooting. Long story short, Jim felt that all his preparations were enough. He quietly waited for his first target in a parking lot. It didn't take long for the target to come, and Jim, without hesitation, immediately finished him off. It turned out that this person was the vice president of a very well-known stock company. The media reported that it was very difficult for the police to find the perpetrator of the shooting because Jim didn't leave traces. In his next action, Jim intended to kill the Minister of Finance. According to him, the minister was the person who should be responsible for the country's dilapidated capitalist system. In his action, Jim secretly watched the minister's house from a distance. Then when he got the opportunity, he immediately shot him with his sniper. After the incident, the police and various media immediately reported about the terror. They concluded that officials in the financial sector had to be careful because there were people who seemed to want to massacre them. That night, Jim acted again, and this time he killed an official who oversaw all central banks throughout America. Jim knew that this person often took policies that always caused misery to the people. 2 days later, Jeremy panicked after hearing a lot of news about the deaths of officials in the financial sector. He was afraid of being killed too, so he immediately asked his assistant to hire a bodyguard to protect the office. On the other hand, Jim finally wanted to gather with his 3 friends, and thanks to them, he could smile again. They then talked about the terror that haunted the officials in the financial sector. Jim openly said that he was the man who had massacred them, and even planned to kill the fraudulent investment company that deceived him. Hearing this, all 3 of his friends laughed because they thought Jim was joking. The next day, Jim disguised himself as a janitor at Jeremy's investment company. It turned out that Jim did this to understand the layout of the building. Every day, he went there until he remembered the building's layout. One day, Jim was walking to the company when he accidentally met Robert, the person who once scammed him, and without the slightest guilt, Robert offered Jim to invest again. He even gave him his new business card. That evening, Jim contacted Robert, pretending that he was going to invest his money again after winning a poker tournament. Hearing this, Robert immediately asked to meet the next day. After the call, Jim went to a quiet place to practice his shooting, which looked increasingly better. The next day, Jim was seen coming to an empty building right in front of Jeremy's company office. He then prepared his ammunition because he was about to slaughter everyone there. Not long after that, Robert walked towards the office, and in that very second, Jim shot him right in the head. After killing Robert, he immediately shot all of Jeremy's employees who had been deceiving everyone. Then, to eliminate his traces, he immediately burned his sniper rifle in that place, then got down and rushed into Jeremy's office via the back entrance. This time, he used a mask to carry out his action. Without hesitation, Jim killed all of Jeremy's remaining employees after letting go of one of them who had a pregnant wife. He also exploded several grenades that he had previously bought. After finishing off all the people in there, Jim went to the top floor to meet Jeremy. Jim was shot in the hand by Jeremy's bodyguard, but luckily was able to finish the man off. Outside the building, the SWAT had just arrived and tried to secure the office one by one. On the other hand, Jim finally met Jeremy. Jim took off his mask and then asked why Jeremy had the heart to lie to the people for his own benefit. Jeremy defended his actions, saying that the famous rich people of history didn't get rich by honest work, and that capitalism is a survival of the fittest society, where the strong survive and the weak die off. Jim then showed him a picture of his wife and told him that he was the reason his wife was dead. Jim, who saw that the SWAT would soon arrive upstairs, challenged Jeremy to a duel. Whoever took the weapon quicker would live, but the moment Jim put the weapon and counted to 2, Jeremy immediately took it and was about to finish off Jim while bragging that he was on top. At the same time, the SWAT entered the room, and when they saw Jeremy holding a gun, the police immediately shot him, thinking he was the person who had just carried out the massacre. Jim, who they considered to be the victim, was immediately taken downstairs to get help. When Jim exited the building and met his 2 police friends, they finally realized that what Jim had said was true. But they certainly would not betray Jim because those he had slaughtered were the bad people. Jim then left. After slaughtering all the dirty officials on Wall Street, he promised to slaughter the judges, lawyers, and all the dirty officials in the legal sector.